Yeah. Why are the Gospels myth? Of course, this is kind of obvious for atheists. So I'm going to start with some of the obvious stuff that you've probably heard before, but you can laugh at some of it. But then I'm going to get into some really esoteric, like heavy-duty biblical scholarship stuff that you probably haven't heard of before, and I'll bet most Christians haven't either. And that's kind of the meat of this. This is going to be the coolest part of it, because it'll be stuff that you haven't heard before about how the Gospels are constructed. So let's begin. The first thing, of course, we have to answer, like, what is myth? What do we mean by myth? And the biggest thing to know about that is that myth is not really a genre. There's been a big debate over what the genre of the Gospels are, for example. But that's actually that's a side note, because really myth can appear in all genres. Myths can be written in history, in the format of history. They can be written in the format of biography. To give you an example, Plutarch wrote A Life of Romulus, which is a traditional, ancient format genre of biography. It's a straightforward historical biography of a guy who never existed. So that's an example right there of it's entirely mythology, but it's being written in the style of the biography. So what are myths? Myths are not really genres, and myths have to do with the content, with the purpose of the myth. Myths use symbol and allegory to communicate values, ideals, and social and cosmic order. They're supposed to teach you about how the universe works, or how the writer wants you to make the universe work. And myths communicate by what they borrow. Oftentimes they'll borrow ideas and motifs from the culture, but also by what they change. And I'm going to make that point clearer later on. And so it's really important. You'll often hear Christian apologists say that, well, this is very different from pagan myths and so forth. So, well, no, the differences are the point. They made those changes on purpose. And all myths do that. Like, they borrow something old, change it up, and then the way they change it is the message of the myth. And so the differences are actually kind of important to the myth, and therefore don't disprove that you're looking at mythical borrowing. Now, the markers of myth include, something doesn't have to have all of these things to be myth, but if it does have all of them, it's probably a myth, and it can have these things in different ways. The first is meaningful emulation of prior myths. I'm going to show you some examples of that later. And then the other is one that you're probably most used to, which is historical improbabilities are frequent and central to the story. Now, you can have like straightforward history that might have an incidental anecdote that has some sort of miracle story in it or something like that, but that's not central to the story. And it's not going to be frequent. It's not going to be integral to the entire story, where all these things happen frequently all the time. The basic idea is that in myths, strange things keep happening. And that includes not just miracles, not supernatural events, but also remarkable coincidences. That's an amazing coincidence, and especially if there's tons of them. It's like that history doesn't work that way. And also unrealistic behaviors. If the people in the story are not acting like real people would act, that's a historical improbability. There's many different ways that you can have historical improbabilities. And when a story is littered with them, and they're central to this plot, you're probably looking at myth. And then, of course, no external corroboration of central characters or events. There may be corroboration of peripheral characters and events, because myths can incorporate historical persons. Pontius Pilate was a historical person, but that doesn't make the Gospels not myth. You can still have a myth with a historical character in it. And there are various other ways to test and look for myth, and I've actually quantified them in logical terms in my book, Proving History. One is the smell test. Is it smell fishy? And I've actually quantified that in terms. Historians would use that phrase, the smell test, but I actually quantify it logically and mathematically. There's the criterion of natural probability, the criterion of vivid narration, and emulation criteria by which we determine whether a myth is being emulated or not. I talk about all of these in Proving History, so if you're interested in those, want to learn more about it, that's the book for you. And I'm not going to go into those. I'm going to actually get right to the chase of the Gospels. There we go. If you want some background, these are some books to look into. The Greek Mythography in the Roman World by Alan Cameron. It's one of my professors at Columbia University. This is a really great book because it really gives you an idea of how myth was being written and composed, and right down to including inventing sources. Mythographers love to make up sources and pretend that they're conveying history, for example, and that might sound familiar to someone. Anyway, Myths of the Underworld Journey is really fascinating because it talks about a mystery cult, salvation cult, but he has a big section in the beginning where he talks about the theory of myth and how it works in history, so it's a really good primer on how myths operate and how they do their business. And then the one that applies it to the Gospels, and I'm normally not a big fan of John Dominic Crossan, but this book, The Power of Parable, is really good, especially for laymen. If you know nothing about the Bible, you'll still enjoy this book. And it really tells, his basic thesis is that the Gospels are parables about Jesus. And so his view is that they're myth as well. And that he gives lots of examples in there and good breakdown. But let's step aside from the Bible and use a model outside the Bible so we don't have these biases one way or another. And I'm going to talk about two authors, Homer and Virgil. Homer wrote in Greek, Virgil in Latin, about 800 years apart. Now, both of them relate a boxing match in their stories. Now, we know these are myths. One is Virgil's book is the Aeneid. It's the myth of the founding of Rome. Nobody questions that it's mythical. Homer, of course, the Odyssey and the Iliad, obviously mythical. But in each of them, they tell this story of a boxing match where these two guys, in the middle of the story, there's this boxing match suddenly occurs for no reason. And they fight each other, and one of them just boasts of how awesome he is and completely trounces the guy, his opponent, and he's carried away, bleeding and spitting out teeth and stuff like that. And that's in Homer. That's Homer's version of it. And they're both young men. They both boast of their youth and prowess. But the one guy is Epeius, which you see on the left there. Epeius, he's the one who boasts of how awesome he is, and he trounces Euryalus and completely annihilates him. And he takes a fall and he's carried away, bleeding and spitting out teeth and whatnot. Now, Virgil tells a very similar story where we have very similar phrases like being carried away and spitting out blood and teeth. But the characters are different, and it occurs at a different time in history. It occurs in a different place. So he's changed it up. And he's also written it in his own style, and there's different other elements have changed. But it's obvious it's the same story. In his story, it's Dares who fights Entellus. These are classical, mythical Roman heroes. But some things have changed that are very key. Dares is still the invincible youth who still boasts of how awesome he is because he's young and powerful and young and great and all of that. And he fights Entellus, who's an old man, and laments his old age and whatnot. And Dares trounces Entellus, and he's knocked down, but instead of being carried away, spitting out blood and teeth, he gets back up and beats the crap out of Dares and teaches him a lesson. And then it's Dares who's carried away, spitting out blood and teeth. Now you can see that they've taken the same mythic story. Virgil's taken Homer's mythic story and he's changed it. Now why has he changed it? He's changed it to make a point that Virgil disagrees, that Virgil as a Roman disagrees with Homer's values, the values that Homer is trying to communicate with his story. And that's the point of the story. It has a moral of the story. It's not historical truth he's going after, it's truth about what we value, what's important, and how the world works. Virgil wants to say, respect your elders, for one thing. Stop boasting if you're some young upstart. And that's a very Roman value. But he's also pointing out a very common element of Roman values, which is that when the Romans get knocked down, they come back and kick your ass. And that was a very common trope in the Romans' ideas of themselves. In fact, it generated the famous line by Pyrrhus, who was one of the generals who fought them. Pyrrhus defeated a Roman legion, so they sent 2 Roman legions, and he defeated those 2 Roman legions, so they sent 3 Roman legions. And I think he finally defeated them, but he said, one more victory like that and I'm done for. Because they were wearing him down, and eventually he was kicked out of Italy. And this was a very common theme for the Romans, that they would get really defeated, but they would come back twice as powerful and win. And in legend and in history, they did this often. So Virgil is capturing Roman values in the way he's changed the story. So you wouldn't come in here like a Virgil apologist and say, the story's got to be true. It looks totally different from the Homer story. There's no relationship whatsoever because it's all the differences. No, you're missing the point. The differences are the point. So that's how myth works. Okay, now let's get back to the context we're talking about, Christian Gospels. The Gospels are faith literature. This is obvious. They're not objective histories, dispassionate histories written by neutral observers. They're faith literature. They're designed for members of a faith group to celebrate and promote their values. Now, when we look at faith literature as a context, almost all of it is bullshit. I mean, this is a fact. We know that there were some 40 Gospels, 40, and not just the 4 that are in the New Testament. We don't have most of these. We know of them only by name and description, most of them. Some of them we have fragments of. But 40 Gospels, and I'm pretty sure there's pretty much every Christian you talk to will agree almost all of them are bullshit, that they're myth. Well, if all of the others are myth, why are we making a special exception for the canonical Gospels? Just because of the ones their church chose to revere doesn't mean that those are the reliable ones. There are also some 6 other Acts, not just the Acts in the New Testament. There's a bunch of others, also mythical, completely made up. There are at least 30 forged epistles. These are letters written by members of the church, disciples, and later leaders. They were completely fake. They're written in someone else's name, often decades or centuries after the fact. And to give you an example of this, we have a find in Nag Hammadi. Nag Hammadi is this Egyptian place where there were these heretics, these Christian heretics, and the Orthodox Christian group was going to come and wipe them out. So they, just before this happened, they took all of their library and stuffed it in a pot and buried it in the desert. And we found it in the 20th century. And we found a bunch of stuff in it. And it's interesting because they clearly just swept the desk and just stuffed the pot without thinking of what they were doing, because we can actually catch them in the act of making up a story. And this is the example of Eugnostos and the Sophia of Jesus Christ. There are these two texts. There's the Eugnostos text, which is this letter written by this guy named Eugnostos, where he gives all this wisdom. And then there's this other text called the Sophia of Jesus Christ, in which there's this whole narrative where the disciples are talking to Jesus and interacting with him. And wouldn't you know, it actually has the exact same lines from Eugnostos, except now, instead of Eugnostos saying them, it's Jesus saying them. And we actually have one of them that's half done. So they were in the process of creating this fake gospel by taking Eugnostos' words, putting them into Jesus' mouth, and inventing a narrative to put it into. So we actually have an example of this happening in real time. And that's probably how most gospels got made. And then there's lots of other, we look at Jewish literature in general, you've got to realize that gospels come from a Jewish sect, ultimately. And we have Exodus, 1 and 2 Kings, Daniel, Esther, the Maccabean literature, there's several of those. Tobit, Joseph, and Asenath is a famous story that was written down. Other testaments and lives of the patriarchs, way beyond what's in the Bible. All of it is made up. All of it is mythical. It's very, very, very hard to find anything that's reliably historical among faith literature, among Jewish literature, or Christian literature, or even pagan literature. Now, I could talk a lot more about what the Gospels don't have in them that would normally indicate that they were histories rather than myths. But if you want more on that, my book, Not the Impossible Faith, talks about it, particularly chapter 7, where I compare the Gospel of Luke, which is the one that tries the most to look like a history, compares that with actual histories, and it doesn't come out well. And really confirming that is The Mystery of Acts by Richard Purvo, which kind of just completely exposes the book of Acts as like bullshit with capital letters all the way across. That's a fascinating short little book. I highly recommend it. But let's talk about those markers of myth I was mentioning earlier. Gospel improbabilities. They're filled with improbabilities. One of them, is the one most obvious, I don't know why it misses most people, is that Jesus walks up, this complete stranger, walks up to these fishermen and says, hey, follow me. We're going to go on a ministry and stuff. And say, yeah, they drop their nets and follow him. There's no persuasion, explains, he doesn't impress them. There's no period of them being admiring his teachings and then coming to him. No, they just immediately drop everything and just follow him and become his permanent disciples immediately from then on. That doesn't happen in reality. That's a historical improbability. That's a myth. That's how you write myths. And then the disciples, like I say, are dumber than a sack of hammers. This is true. For example, they engage in the one miraculous feeding where Jesus miraculously feeds thousands of people. And then he does it again, and they, with the same situation, they go, well, how are we going to feed these people? And then they're completely amazed that he could miraculously feed them all. As if they didn't know about the previous event. And there's lots of other things they do that are bumbling and stupid. Real people don't behave that way. And their inability to understand his teachings consistently throughout the Gospels makes no sense, because you could realize they're walking around with this guy all the time, like 4 or 5 hour conversation with him, and they'd get everything nailed. There wouldn't be a problem. They wouldn't be still not understanding anything he said after weeks of traveling with the guy. So this is myth. This is not history. The idea that the Jews needed Judas to identify Jesus makes no sense. There's no plausibility, no historical plausibility in the whole Judas betrayal story. The Jews hold an illegal trial, according to their own laws, and execution on a high holy day, which is stupid because they even say, in the Gospel say, that's going to start a riot. But they did it anyway, which makes no sense. What they would do is they would just capture him, put him in jail, and wait until the holiday left and all the pilgrims left town. And then you'd execute him, right? That's how people, or they'd have him assassinated, like we know several other examples. They just kill him in the streets and it'd be done with. That's how history really proceeds. But no, that would ruin the great story the Gospels want to tell. So they have to have the Jews engage in illegal and stupid activities. And then, of course, Jesus flies through the air with the devil. He's fed by angels and magical animals. Classic myth. The nativity stories, the miracle tales, the horde of undead. Matthew has all of the old saints rise from their graves and walk into the city and are seen by many people in Jerusalem. This is myth. This is a historical improbability. This is what we're talking about. It's littered with them. The Gospels are full of these. But to give you some classic examples I'm going to talk more about later. Jesus withers a fig tree for not bearing figs. I mean, he magically curses it. And it dies within a day, even though it was not the season for figs. The gospel says that. Even though it was not the season for figs, it wasn't bearing figs. Jesus got mad, cursed it, withered it. You shall never bear figs again. Now, of course, obviously people can't magically wither fig trees. This isn't Harry Potter. But so that in itself is obvious. But even the behavior of someone who would curse a fig tree for not bearing figs, even though it's not time to bear figs, that in itself is a historical probability. It's a paradox. It's the sort of thing that must mean something. We should look more closely at what the meaning of it is. There's a famous thing where Jesus clears the temple square. He drives out all the sellers from the temple. Little historical context. The temple square that he cleared was over 12 acres in size. It was filled with hundreds of people, and there was an armed battalion on station specifically to prevent exactly that kind of action. So there's absolutely no historical plausibility to this story at all, so much so that Jesus historians who want to preserve the story, like Bruce Chilton, for example, will make up the idea that, Jesus must have come in with an armed force. Of course, that's not what the Gospels say. And that's kind of like trying to make the evidence fit the facts. But no, in reality, the story is mythical. This is a myth. This is not something that happened. And then, of course, the Jews know to guard the tomb in Matthew, but not in Mark, Luke, or John. Even though in the guard story, the guards are paralyzed by a flying monster from outer space. How do you leave that story out? I mean, that's like the greatest story ever. Yet obviously mythical. Another example, which you may have heard before, is the Rank-Raglan mythotype, or the Rank-Raglan hero score. There's a whole bunch of ancient heroes who fit this profile, and it's about 22 attributes. And certain heroes meet several of these attributes. Certain historical persons do as well. They got myths written about them. But it's interesting, when they do match the profile, they usually match it through myth-making rather than actual historical facts. But more importantly, I'm not going to read through the whole list. More importantly, every single one of them, every single person we know who meets more than half of the 22 elements, so more than half of the 22, every single one of them is fictional. I mean, or at least we have no reason to believe any of these guys are historical, and this is the list of the ones we know. And Jesus scores 20. He's one of the highest scoring members of this class of heroes. He scores 20 if you count all the Gospels, especially Matthew. Matthew is the one that really makes Jesus into a Rank-Raglan hero. But even if you count Mark alone, you said it's just the first Gospel, the Gospel of Mark, he still rates 14, which is above half, and so he's well within the mythical sphere. Now, if all 15 of the people we know, 14 if you don't biasly count Jesus, if all 15 of them are mythical, why are we making exception for Jesus? We should immediately be curious about that. But even regardless of whether you think Jesus existed or not, the fact that Jesus scores so high on the Rank-Raglan hero score tells you, and he scores this way only through the Gospels, tells you that the Gospels are myth. The Gospels are taking this character and mythifying him, making him fit this mythotype. Now there's another mythotype called the Ascension mythotype that fit a lot of other heroes. And this has been demonstrated recently by Richard Miller in this article that I'm mentioning here. And unfortunately, I can't cite all of the scholars that all of this stuff comes from, but very little of this is my own original research. This is stuff that other scholars have published, but it's scattered everywhere. What I've done is I've gathered it all together. So occasionally, I'll throw the kudos to whoever found these things first. And the Ascension mythotype are 20 attributes regarding these heroes that have these attributes. The hero is a son of a god. His death is accompanied by prodigies, and the land is covered in darkness. His corpse goes missing. He receives a new immortal body. The new body is occasionally radiant. He meets a follower on a road from a city. He gives a speech from a high place. In that speech, he delivers a message about his resurrection or translation to heaven. He gives a great commission to future followers. He ascends to heaven. He's taken up into a cloud. There's an explicit role for eyewitnesses. Eyewitnesses are named and mentioned. The eyewitnesses are frightened by either his appearance or his disappearance after his death. Some of them flee. There's a reference to dubious alternative accounts. If those of you who are familiar with the Gospel of Matthew, you will remember there's the dubious account that the Jews were spreading, the lie that the body was stolen, right? So that this is actually a common feature of these Ascension mythotypes, that there's references to a dubious alternative account of what happened. It occurs outside of a central city. The followers are initially in sorrow, but the resurrection story they receive leads to belief, homage, and rejoicing, and the hero is subsequently deified and cult is paid to him. Now this fits Jesus, but it also fits Romulus, the national founder of Rome, and several other heroes of the time, and Richard Miller talks about that. Another one is the dying and rising God myth theme more broadly, or even more broadly than that specific one. Romulus, again, state God. His death and resurrection was celebrated in annual passion plays. So this was a very well-known resurrected God, and he was central to Roman society and state at the time. Osiris is one, Egyptian god. Those baptized into his death and resurrection are saved in the afterlife. Sounds familiar, right? Zalmoxis is a Thracian god. His death and resurrection also assures followers of eternal life. And there are several others in this category. These aren't the only ones. These are just the ones that we can prove that these stories pre-exist Christianity. And I talk about them and more in Not the Impossible Faith. But I have to clarify that there's sometimes this type is misrepresented on the internet. For example, Mithra is sometimes put on this list of a dying and rising god. He's not. We have no evidence that Mithra was a dying and rising god. And various other things like that he was born on December 25th and things like that could be debatable. But more importantly, even Jesus wasn't born on December 25th until much later. So we want to talk about the origins of Christianity. We have to talk about how Jesus was originally, not all the stuff that was tacked onto him later. But what all these gods do have in common, Mithra included, is that they are all savior gods, personal savior gods. They're all the son of God. There's a few occasions of daughters of God who get this honor. They all undergo a passion. It's the same word in Greek that describes their struggle or suffering. You could call it a passion play or a passion story. They all do. They all obtain victory over death by one manner or another, which they share with their followers, and that's how they become a savior. Whatever great struggle they underwent gives them power over death. And they all have stories about them set in human history on earth, yet none of them ever actually existed. So to see that Jesus is so quickly and rapidly fitted to this type in the Gospels is a giveaway. Also, there's tons of emulation of Homer and the Septuagint. The Septuagint is the Greek translation, the ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament and other related texts. The Gospels emulate this. The Gospels authors were actually trying to create their own, literally their own New Testament to replace the Old Testament. They wanted to get rid of the old one, get the best stories from it, and change them up, put Jesus in them, and then that would be their new Bible. That was their objective. And these books here that I have listed are the best ones to look at to see examples of the things I'm about to talk about. I won't be talking about Homeric borrowing, but I will talk about the Septuagint borrowing. So let's get to another weird thing. This is where it gets more esoteric. This is more into literary theory. Mythic structure. I call it the original Lord of the Rings, because the Gospels employ heavily this thing called ring structure. That's formal terms for it are chiasmus and inclusio. This kind of structure, you see it like on the right-hand side, the A, B, C, C, B, A, where you have this sort of onion-layered nesting of ideas that all relate to each other. And so this structure doesn't fit history. History doesn't proceed in this sort of organized way. And I'll show you some examples so you can see what I mean. This was only used in antiquity in real histories or biographies when they were non-chronological. For example, Suetonius writes a whole bunch of biographies, and all of them follow ring structure very faithfully. But his biographies aren't chronological. They start with a birth and end with a death, but everything in between is organized by theme, which makes it possible for him to create his chiasmus. Because history doesn't work out that way, so you have to do it non-chronologically. But the Gospels work chronologically, so you can immediately be suspicious when they start doing this. This is also, some biblical scholars literally call these Markan sandwiches. And to give you an example, there's a story where there's a dying 12-year-old girl. Jesus is told about this. And then he goes and heals this girl. But in between, this story is interrupted by another story of a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years. And so this is an inclusio, where we have the story starts one way, it gets interrupted by another story, and then the original story ends. And that's telling you that the two stories relate to each other. There's some meaning about that. This is not how history works. This is how literature works. This is how myth is written. Another example is that fig tree I was talking about. Jesus curses the fig tree. So we have the story of Jesus and the cursed fig tree. Then Jesus clears the temple, and then Jesus goes out and confirms that the fig tree is withered and gives a speech about it. So here we have the fig tree cursing story. Stuck in the middle of it is Jesus clearing the temple story. Now, we already know these stories are bogus, like I told you before. But the fact that they're nested like this, that they're turned into this chiasmus of inclusio, of or Markan sandwich, as it were, tells you that there's some meaning to it. There's some reason. These stories are related. You're supposed to understand the connection. Now, the ultimate sandwiches are the ones where the beginning of a gospel matches the end, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. Mark 1 matches Mark 15 to 16, and we're talking about Jesus and John the Baptist and the crucifixion and empty tomb story. And to give you an example of how these are paired up, this is in the Gospel of Mark. John is said to cry with a loud voice, same Greek. Jesus cries with a loud voice, nearly the same Greek. An allusion is made to Elijah in both accounts, and very prominent allusion is made to Elijah. The heavens are torn, using the same Greek word in the Baptist story, but in the crucifixion story, the temple curtain is torn, using the exact same Greek word. And in antiquity, the temple curtain involved, the one that would have been torn, was a symbol of the barrier between heaven and earth, and even had the heavens painted on it, we know from Josephus. So these are clearly designed to echo each other. The beginning is designed to match the end. In the beginning, we hear the Holy Spirit descends upon Jesus. Literally, the pneuma descended on him. And in the crucifixion story, the Holy Spirit departs from Jesus. Literally, he exhaled the pneuma. In the beginning, God calls Jesus his son. God calls down from heaven and says, "You are my son." In the end, a centurion, a Roman centurion and an official of Rome, calls Jesus God's son. That's not a coincidence. That's deliberate. That was put in there to mimic the beginning. This is how myth proceeds. This is not how history is written. Similarly, the beginning of the gospel is, "Behold, I send my messenger before you, the voice of one calling out in the wilderness, make ready the way of the Lord." The end of the gospel, the women who find the empty tomb are told by some young man there, "Go, tell his disciples and Peter that he goes before you into Galilee." But the women, they fled from the tomb and they said nothing to anyone. So what do we have here? We have a mirror image. We have the exact opposite. It's been transformed. John, a man, delivers the message fearlessly and loudly to everyone, preparing the path for the Lord. But the women fail to deliver the message they are given, and so do not prepare the path of the Lord because of fear, and instead are silent and tell no one. These are directly opposite of each other. And notice that this is actually how the gospel ends. The women run away and don't tell anyone. That's the weird ending to the gospel. And you want to know why would the gospel end that way? Well, it's ending exactly opposite the way the gospel began. And similarly, in the beginning, Jesus comes from Galilee, and then enters the wilderness to battle Satan. At the end, Jesus goes to Galilee after having left the wilderness, in this case the land of the dead, having defeated Satan. Of course, that's not explicitly said, but you're supposed to understand that that's what has happened. So again, the beginning is a mirror image of the ending. That's deliberate. And that's how myth is written. This is another example by Norman Peterson, the trad exact cycles in Mark. This is a very elegant structure. This is in a section of Mark that goes from Mark 4 to Mark 8, where we have 3 cycles with the same phases and then 2 intervals. And if you look, they're all matching up. This exact same story is basically being told 3 times and interrupted by the exact same story being told 2 times. But they're not the exact same story. They're tweaked a little bit different. He's meeting different people, but there's a lot of similarities. Now the key thing here is in each phase occurs during the day, then the next phase occurs during the evening, then the next phase occurs the next day. So that's one complete day, the middle of one day to the middle of the next. Notice what we're talking about here. It's 3 cycles, 3 days. So this whole story from Mark 4 to Mark 8 takes place over 3 days. When you understand that and read the story, you'll be mind amazed that all of this stuff occurs in 3 days. It's rather convenient. That's an example of a historical improbability. Very coincidental. In each step 1, in the intervals, Jesus, in each case, he meets in a house with women and children are somehow involved in the story. Each step 2 features the disciples on the one hand and the authorities on the other. And each step 3 inverts the other. In the first one, his amazed family disbelieves in him. In the other, amazed foreigners believe in him, using some of the similar words. So clearly we're looking at messages here. There's symbolic reason for these interposition and mirroring of the different passages. Every single scene in this whole sequence contrasts human expectations with spiritual realities, and it contrasts the faith of outsiders versus the faithlessness of insiders, and using different examples of outsiders, family versus not family, Jews versus non-Jews, and so on. And all of this occurs in just 3 carefully choreographed days, with pretty much the same events occurring, very similar events occurring. So that's how myth is written. This is another example. This is the chiasmus. Here it goes A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L. Then backwards K, J, I, H, G, F, E, D, C, B, A. This is the entire Gospel of Matthew, from beginning to end, first verse to last. The entire Gospel is an elegant, extremely carefully crafted chiasmus. And I'm going to talk about a different. Well, I'll talk about a different one in a moment. But you can see here, for example, we have a genealogy, which is a summary of past times, matches up with a commission, which is a summary of future times. And that's the beginning and end. But let me show you an example of where this is going to work. Yay! So you notice here, layer H of the onion. It says John's ministry. So we look what's corresponding to it in layer H in the second half? John's death. That's not a coincidence. Matthew has deliberately placed it there. And if we keep going in the onion, we get a rejection of Jesus in the first half, a rejection of Jesus in the second half. We get secrets revealed through Jesus in the first half, secrets revealed through Jesus in the second half. We get attack of the Pharisees, matches up with condemnation of the Pharisees. Right in between, which is the center of the entire chiasmus, is Pharisees determined to kill God's servant. That's the central message of Matthew's gospel. But he does all kinds of things. For example, the baptism of Jesus. What pairs up with that in the chiasmic structure? The transfiguration of Jesus. And there are many verbal similarities between those two stories. And you can go through this whole thing item by item, and it really matches up. Now, this is a very carefully written, and I must emphasize written, myth. I mean, this is a literary masterpiece, in effect. This is not some oral story that was passed down. And I'll give you another example of the beginning matching the end. You ever wonder about the story in Matthew, and it's only in Matthew, where it said that they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God is with us, and yet that he's never called Emmanuel, and that's forgotten forever for the rest of the gospel. Well, one of the last words Jesus says in the gospel is, I am with you always. Hint, hint. So you get the point, right? And it's not explicitly said, I am God, and I'm with you always. Remember when they were going to call me Emmanuel? You know, he doesn't say that. It's just the way that Matthew structures his gospel is communicating that, and that's a mythic mode of communication. This is Matthew's crucifixion narrative. So there are many of these chiasmuses inside the whole chiasmus of the gospel. And Matthew does it again. It's an extremely elegant chiasmus of the crucifixion. So, for example, Judas exposed, right here, layer E. What does that line up with? Well, temple exposed. Well, that's interesting. Judas betrays Jesus. What does that line up with? Oh, Judas hangs himself. Well, that's a coincidence. And there are lots of these different things like this. Well, for example, there are preparations. Judas is enlisted and the Passover is prepared, lines up with results. Jesus' lordship is confirmed and the least are faithful. And you look at all of these, they line up either as mirror images of each other or as commentaries on each other. And notice again, layer B, priest's plot, layer B, priest's plot again. Matthew went out of his way to invent a second plot to make it fit his structure. So this is myth writing. This is how you write myths, not histories. Sorry to say, even the Sermon on the Mount is an example of this. This is Dale Allison in this article has demonstrated this. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but this is an extremely elegant, this is a whole Sermon on the Mount diagram. It's extremely elegant chiasmus of multiply triadic structure. This is an elegant oration that was clearly written from beginning to end with careful attention to every single component. This is not some discourse that was just orally delivered from a hill somewhere. This is a literary masterpiece. It's extremely elaborate structures. This is not oral, this is written. It's composed in Greek. We can tell that it was originally composed in Greek. It wasn't translated from Aramaic or Hebrew. One of the reasons we know that is because it's dependent for a lot of its arguments and vocabulary on the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And we know Jesus wasn't walking around Galilee quoting the Septuagint and basing his arguments and stuff on the exact wording of the Septuagint. He would have been using Hebrew or Aramaic versions of the Bible. So we know whoever wrote the Sermon on the Mount was not Jesus. It was some very expert Greek orator. Another reason we know that is because the entire thing, from beginning to end, assumes that the temple cult doesn't exist anymore, which makes no sense for Jesus. One of the most important things Jesus would have to say in this speech is, well, okay, this temple cult still exists. This is how you need to react to it. For example, at the very least, he would say, don't go to the temple, or stop using the temple cult, or the temple cult won't save you, or whatever. But no, he doesn't even acknowledge the existence of the temple cult. Throughout the whole thing, this speech simply assumes it doesn't exist anymore. And one of the things that Allison pointed out is that the three pillars that the sermon is constructed of, which is how to obey the Torah, how to pay cult to God, and how to deal with society. Those are the three structural components of the Sermon on the Mount. These were the three pillars that rabbis, after the destruction of the temple, developed to sort of save their religion. Because the question became, once the temple cult was destroyed, how do we pay cult to God? We don't have a temple anymore. So the rabbis came up, well, we have the three pillars, and they came up with the exact same thing: how to obey the Torah, how to pay cult to God, how to deal with society. So they have Jesus giving the exact same speech in his version of this rabbinical response to the destruction of the temple, which implicitly assumes that you can't pay cult to God through the temple because it doesn't exist anymore, means that this was written after the destruction of the temple. It was written by someone, not Jesus. So much for the Sermon on the Mount. This is mythic writing. I'll give you an example from Luke of beginning matching the end. There's the story, and these only in Luke, by the way, of the boy Jesus in the temple. Jesus gets lost and they run back and find him. And then there's the story of Jesus meeting the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. Luke 2 and Luke 24. They both have the same structure. The day after Passover is when the first story occurs. The day after Passover is when the second story occurs. In both stories, a couple is departing Jerusalem. The story focuses on that. In the one story, they find Jesus is not with them. In the other story, they think Jesus is not with them, even though he's with them in disguise. In the one story, they're distraught that Jesus is not with them. And in the other story, it makes a point of noting that they're also distraught that Jesus is not with them. In the first story, they quickly return to Jerusalem as soon as they realize he is absent. In the second story, they quickly return to Jerusalem as soon as they realize he is present. In the first story, they find Jesus after 3 days. That's a curious thing to put in that story. Why say that? Because in the second story, they find Jesus on the third day. These stories are mirroring each other on purpose. In both stories, Jesus asks them a question. In the first, he says, "Why are you looking for me?" In the second, he asks, "What are you talking about?" In both stories, he amazes with his knowledge of Scripture. He just is an incredible interpreter of Scripture that amazes those present. In both stories, he explains something about what's going on as necessary, using the same Greek word. It's necessary for me to be among the things of my Father, in other words, to be in my Father's house. And in the second story, it's necessary for the Messiah to suffer these things. These stories parallel each other. Come on now. Oops. There we go. Now, both stories feature people not understanding what has happened, very prominently, improbable. Both feature a disappearance of Jesus. That's a weird coincidence. Both of them climax on the third day. Both stories suddenly appear for the first time in Luke, despite being far too remarkable for any previous gospel to have omitted them. These are great stories. Why haven't you heard them before? The fact that we only hear of them together in the exact same book where they both mirror each other is a sure giveaway that author made them up. He made them up specifically to mirror each other. That's myth-making. Now, the real clincher here is that in Codex Bezdai, it's not Emmaus, but Ulamios, which is the name given in the Septuagint for the town that Jacob renamed Bethel, which famously meant God's house. And so in Emmaus, it was instead God's house that they met Jesus. So in the first story, they find Jesus in God's house, and in the second story, they find Jesus in God's house. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that was probably the original reading of the text. Certainly, whoever changed the reading of the text understood the story and understood they were paralleling each other. That's how those things happen. The same thing happens with John and the Cana miracle. Here we have the first miracle at Cana occurs on the third day, and then there's a sequence of events that ends with a second miracle that Jesus performs, also at Cana, also on the third day. That's too coincidental to be historical. Jesus spends 2 days in between with the Samaritans, the same number of days Jesus would later reside in the land of the dead, but he even dies at the very hour that he meets the first Samaritan. John goes out of his way to say that he meets this first Samaritan at the 6th hour. Why that detail? What's that there for? Well, it's therefore to clue you in that this is a symbol of the resurrection. This is a myth that's saying something about the resurrection of Jesus. Jesus' descent into Samaria and return is thus a metaphor for his death and resurrection. And by the way, none of this Cana sequence occurs in any other gospel. This is unique to John. The first miracle of Cana, of course, is he turns water into wine. No one had heard of that before. That's a really amazing, remarkable miracle. No one had heard of it before. It's unique to John's gospel. You know what's also unique to John's gospel? Water and blood run from Jesus' wound at the crucifixion. No other author had heard of that. So once again, just like Luke, we have water and wine and water and blood, two miracles that are paired together from beginning to end in the same author, and they appear at the same time. We've never heard of them before, and so suddenly they're together. these are deliberate design. This is by deliberate design. These stories are made up for this purpose. And the last miracle at Cana is the rescuing of a son from death, which is a parallel for Jesus, who is also a son who will be rescued from death. And in between, John the Baptist explains Jesus is the bridegroom. He gives a discourse on that, echoing the wedding at Cana. And that Jesus is the Savior, echoing the saving of a child at the end of Cana. So in the middle, we have John the Baptist basically telling you what all of this is about, wink, wink, hint, hint. But at the beginning of the sequence, we have the wedding. At the end, we have the saving. And then, of course, John says that people should believe on Jesus' word alone. You shouldn't need these signs. You should just believe because he says it. You should believe what you're told. Hint, hint, wink, wink. So that's myth-making there. Now, the Cana episode has a very elaborate structure as well. I'm not going to go into it. But the author that I flashed on the screen earlier has analyzed it, and it's very elegant, it's very meaningful, but it's very mythical. This is not history. Jesus is Moses. This is another thing you probably heard. Jesus is basically the new Moses. One of the examples of that is the fact that in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus performs, in one particular section of Mark, he performs 2 sequences of 5 miracles each. Now, Moses also famously performed 5 miracles in the desert. And Jesus explores mastery of the waters. He stills the storm. In another sequence, he walks on the sea. He exorcises people. He exorcises a Gentile man, the Gerasene demoniac. In the second sequence, he exorcises a Gentile woman, notably Gentiles. And also in the first sequence, he cures 2 women. In the second sequence, he cures 2 men. And it's the woman with hemorrhage and then Jairus' daughter, which is that inclusio I was talking about earlier. The 12-year-old girl and the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years. Jesus also engages in miraculous feedings, 1 in each sequence, and he cures a blind man. Now, notably, both the curing of the men, and Jesus has to use spit. He uses spit and rubs it on whatever he's going to cure, which is a curious thing. Now, Moses did these things too. Moses parted the waters and walked across it, so he also mastered the sea and walked on the sea in that sense. Moses also defeated the forces of evil. As long as he held up his wand, he could stop the Amalekite soldiers from defeating the Jerusalemites, or defeating the Israelites. And Jesus also has power over evil, except the evil he's fighting are demons, not soldiers, literally. Moses also cured diseases. There's the story of the sky tree that he called out from the sky and it fell into the water that was bitter and made it drinkable. And then God gives a speech about how he can cure all your illnesses. Moses also miraculously fed thousands with the manna miracle. And Moses caused water of life to flow from the rock, which is the exact opposite of the blood of death flowing from the woman. Now the curious thing is, in the Gerasene demoniac story, the demons are described as soldiers. That's a weird thing, right? But remember, Moses, in the Moses miracle, he defeated soldiers as well. So the demons that Jesus kills, the 2,000 pigs that run into the water and drown, Jesus is a mass pig murderer, are described as soldiers. That's to evoke the Moses parallel. Similarly, why does he expel a demon from a Syro-Phoenician woman? Well, a Syro-Phoenician is a northern Canaanite. The Amalekites are southern Canaanites. The illusion is probably intentional. Another weird thing, the blind man who's cured, when he's cured, Jesus tries to cure him and he doesn't succeed exactly, and the blind man can only see trees. He thinks everybody walking around there, I see trees walking around, so Jesus has to cure him again. Because the Son of God wasn't powerful enough, apparently. Why? What's that doing there? That's a weird detail to add. Well, of course, the reference to curing diseases occurs in the sky tree story in Moses. It was the tree that fell from the sky and fell into the water, which caused the curing of diseases and made it possible, or caused God to talk about his ability to cure diseases and made the water drinkable. So a little allusion to the trees has been thrown into the story. And again, the flow of blood was killing the woman, the flow of water from the rock saved the Jews. So these are opposites, but they're intentional allusions to each other. Like Moses, Jesus' miraculous feeding also takes place in the wilderness, also involved gathering up of food. Everyone is fed, and they end up with more than they start with. The stories make a particular point of saying they ended up with more than they start with. Both stories do this. Similarly, in the story when he cures the 12-year-old girl, Jesus takes only his top 3 apostles with him into the bedchamber, just as Moses took only 3 elders with him to strike the rock, to strike water from the rock. And just as the Jews were perishing and worried about dying, these particular points are made in the Exodus story, Mark has a woman perishing and a girl who died. So this whole sequence of miracles is designed to rewrite the Exodus, to make Jesus a better Moses, a new Moses, their Moses. And just as the tree had to go in the water to inspire the story about God healing diseases, spit has to go on the disease. So the idea that Jesus had to use spit is again a reference to the role of trees in the water. And then in this story of the sky tree, God says, if you will diligently hear the voice of the Lord your God, and will do what is pleasing in his sight, and will give ear to his commandments, then God will heal you. So obviously Jesus heals eyes, ears, and voice. That's why he heals a blind man and a deaf mute. It's all borrowing from the Moses story. And conversely, on the other side, as we saw, the first sequence of the 5 miracles tracks the water from a rock narrative. The 2 women who are healed are connected to the water from the rock narrative, just as the 2 men who are healed are connected to the sky tree narrative. Which means that Mark knows that he is doubling his miracle stories to make 2 sets of 10. This is his decalogue of faith. Now, a lot of scholars have argued that Mark must have confusedly found 2 different sources with 2 sets of 5, and he just put them all together, like he didn't know any better. But in reality, that's not the case. Mark has deliberately doubled his narratives, and he's very consciously done that. And then there's Jesus as Elijah, Elisha. Many authors have pointed this out, I mean lots of them, that Jesus is also rewritten as a new Elijah, better Elijah. I won't cover all of these, but this is an example where the Gospel of Luke in particular is reversing and transforming and rewriting the Book of Kings. It's basically saying, the Book of Kings, there's some great ideas in there, so I'm going to take those good ideas and I'm going to write a new book entirely. I'm going to put Jesus in there and make him the lead character, and then make it say the things I want it to say. And so he's basically creating his new Book of Kings. And just like 1 and 2 Kings, we also have the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts. Luke also wrote 2 books. So he's very consciously trying to create new scripture for the Christians. And a particular example is 1 Kings 17 versus Luke 7. Very similar stories where we get the exact same Greek in some places. It happened after this, it happened afterwards. At the gate of Sarepta, Elijah meets a widow. At the gate of 9, Jesus meets a widow. Another widow's son was dead in the Elijah story. This widow's son was dead in the Jesus story. That widow expresses a sense of her unworthiness on account of sin. In the Jesus story, a centurion, whose boy Jesus had just saved from death, so the story is leading in, had just expressed the same sense of his unworthiness on account of sin. Elijah compassionately bears her son up the stairs and asks the Lord why he was allowed to die. In the Jesus story, the Lord, Jesus, feels compassion for her and touches her son's bier that they're carrying the body on, and the bearer stands still. So we have parallels and reversals. Elijah prays to the Lord for the son's return to life, and the Lord, in the Jesus story, the Lord commands the boy to rise. The boy comes to life and cries out, very specific detail. And just as that happens in the Jesus story, and he who was dead sat up and began to speak. It's the exact same story we're hearing here, being modified into new time, new hero. This is just like what Virgil did to Homer. And he gave him to his mother. The exact same line, word for word in Greek, it's entirely the same. It appears in both stories, and that's the dead giveaway, when they borrow an exact same sentence from each other. And the widow recognizes Elijah is a man of God, and that the word he speaks is the truth. And then the people recognize Jesus as a great prophet of God, and the word of his truth spreads everywhere. So what we're seeing here is a transformation of the Bible. This is myth-making. This is not history. Now, there are common objections to what I've talked about, and I basically dispatched them all in my book, Proving History. Some of them I'm going to dispatch even more ruthlessly in my next book on the historicity of Jesus Christ. But one of them is rapid legendary development is impossible. I think, judging from just the evidence I've shown you already, that's a non-starter. Obviously, that's false. But we have many examples of rapid legendary development that show that the idea that it's impossible is not true. People will say, some of the excuses will be that, the myths would be gainsaid. They can't be lies. So if someone would have said that they're false, and it's like, well, who? And do we have their book? No. So if the Christians get to choose which books get transmitted, and we don't get to read what other people were saying, we can't really say that the myths would be gainsaid. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. We don't know. The other one is we can recover the historical core, even though it's all myth. Yes, there's some Christians who say, okay, there's a lot of myth here, but there's still some facts. We can get those facts out of there using criteria. That entire method is bankrupt, and that's really the main point of my book, Proving History, where I thoroughly debunk that whole concept. All 18 of the most common criteria I analyze one by one, showing that they're actually fallacious or fallaciously applied. So we can't really do that, not with the Gospels. The Gospels are not adequate material for this function. So that's just a really quick tour of some of the stuff. I mean, I could have done twice as much time talking about examples like this. And lots of great ones. I had to cut some cool stories, unfortunately. So yeah, that's it. So I think we'll go to break, and then we'll do Q&A after that.
So let me just get this out here. Thanks, Richard. A hand for Richard. I think it's going to be crowded back there, so I'll just show you some of the books. We have Why I'm Not a Christian. It's a very short, easily gifted book that kind of gives some very strong and simple arguments if someone asks you why you don't believe. Not the Impossible Faith, I've read this one, and actually has some really cool, interesting facts about Jerusalem and the history of the ancient times, and kind of talks about how the Christianity could actually have been completely not true and still developed the way that it did and been so popular. I don't know if that's a good summary or not, Richard, but
good enough.
And then Proving History. I'm still working on this one. There's a little math in there, but it's not too bad.
Sixth grade math. So.
Sixth grade math, so you can handle it. This is the hardcover. This one is 25, I believe. Not the Impossible Faith is 20, and the smaller one is 10. And so you could buy all three, right? I'll give that to you. And then there are a couple other things I want to mention. The bathrooms, and there's a water fountain down the hall. If you want a snack or a drink, I think you have to go downstairs. If you do that, please take care of your trash. I would appreciate it. We run on donations, so we'd love if you can donate. That'd be great. About $5 would cover our expense for you to be here. So throwing a number out there, it makes it easier for you guys to pick something. And what I'd like you to do is take the next 10 minutes, get up, walk around, think of some great questions for Richard, and we'll come back and do some Q&A. Thanks. Credit card here.